Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Thanks for tuning into the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you, of course, by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Josh Hadley, and I want to ask you guys something. So this is about sci-fi, right? This is a sci-fi podcast. This is a sci-fi show. So what is it about sci-fi that makes you like it? Now, first of all, I'm not the hugest fan of the word sci-fi or the abbreviation sci-fi. I prefer science fiction. Sci-fi is just sort of that pop culture abbreviation, and I have an issue with it. I prefer it's science fiction, and don't even get me started on the Sci-Fi Channel now that it's spelled SciFi, which sounds to me like a venereal disease that nerds get. But when it comes to science fiction, what is it that drew you to it in the first place? And not just that, what is it that keeps you involved in it? And by that I mean, do you remember, was it exploring other worlds? Was it spaceships? Was it fighting aliens? Was it laser guns? Was it time travel? Was it a Viking blipped from another dimension? What is it, or what was it about science fiction that drew you in? Because I've been thinking about that. I started reading, I'm older than a lot of you. I started reading science fiction at I'm older, so I started reading it earlier than a lot of you did. Like, I remember when William Gibson's Neuromancer first came out in 1984. Like I said in an earlier show, I was way too young to be reading that. I didn't understand a damn thing of it. But I was always drawn to the science fiction side of things. And not just science fiction in that sci-fi sort of way, but also horror, fantasy, a slasher movie or a monster movie or a demon movie or something like creepy or eerie for the comic books. And then all of a sudden you'd be into Conan and Deathstalker and the Roger Corman ripoffs, or something like Piranha and Jaws. I was always drawn to monsters and the genre. I was always drawn to that. And that's what I think is so interesting when you meet other people, when you meet other science fiction fans. It's what got them into it. Now, obviously, all science fiction fans don't agree. We can all agree that we can't agree. There are people who think Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Joss Whedon are pure genius. I think they're absolute mind-numbing garbage. And you might say that about some of the shows I've talked about in previous episodes. Or you might think William Gibson is nothing but a ceaseless hack. I would disagree with that. So we're not going to agree on it. So then what does that mean that we're all still in the same community? Because we are in the same community, really. It's sort of the same thing when you're a sports fan. And I don't just mean a fan of sports, that you don't just watch the sports ball. But baseball fans, you're all baseball fans. Okay, you root for different teams. You root for different players. But you're all baseball fans. Football fans, maybe you love the Packers. Maybe you love the Cowboys. Maybe you love the Bears. But you're all football fans. And that's the way we are here as a community, as a science fiction, sci-fi community. We should be united. Now, that doesn't mean we all have to like what everyone else likes. I'm not a fan of Batman. Lots of people love Batman. That doesn't make my opinion any more or less relevant than those who like Batman. So then the question is, what is it that draws us in? And what is it that keeps us here? Because right now, I would argue, science fiction is bigger than it's, ever been before. I think the fact that the people who used to beat me up in high school because I was reading a comic book are now the first ones in line for an Avengers movie. That says a lot. That people who've never read a comic book, who have no idea who PKD, Philip K. Dick, are, who've never read anything by Edgar Rice Burroughs, who the first time they ever heard the name John Carter, Warlord of Mars, was when the Disney flop came out a couple of years ago. People who have never engaged in science fiction outside of maybe that thing that you watched, that, you saw the movie flipping channels one day, or something huge like The Matrix or something along those lines. So I would argue that science fiction and sci-fi are bigger now than they've ever been before. Why is that, though? Is it just that the internet opened this up? That now it's easier for science fiction fans to meet one another? Or is it something deeper? Is it something more that... Because to me, science fiction isn't about ray guns. It isn't about spaceships. It isn't about flying through the cosmos. It isn't about blowing things up. It isn't about big bug-eyed aliens. It isn't about something bursting out of your chest or a monster from millions of years ago that's awakened or anything like that. That, to me, is not what science fiction is. Science fiction is ideas. And that is why I think science fiction endures. It's about ideas. It's not about laser guns. It's not about the trappings. Because if you really think about it, a lot of like TV shows and movies that we think of as science fiction really are just something with science fiction slapped on top of it. Like Star Trek. I love Star Trek. Star Trek, from the classic series all the way to the garbage that is Picard, they're Westerns. They're Westerns with some cop show elements, and they just are Westerns in space. The Enterprise is the stagecoach. Scotty is the engineer that keeps everything running. They have their 6-shooters and phasers. They go from planet to planet playing cops. So something like Star Trek is obviously science fiction, but it's also just something where science fiction can technically just be slapped on top of something else. Like Star Wars. Star Wars is an old Japanese adventure, but with laser swords instead of swords. And instead of wizards, you have the Force. So when I'm talking about science fiction, true science fiction, it is about ideas. When you've got somebody like Philip K. Dick, or Edgar Rice Burroughs, or Harlan Ellison, or Ray Bradbury, or Robert E. Howard, those were ideas. These were people who were thinking above and beyond. Did the stories all work? Of course they didn't. Sometimes they were just dated. Sometimes they were not thought out well enough. Sometimes they were just bad ideas to begin with. But science fiction is all about ideas. And that's what I think is lost a lot of times when the trappings of science fiction are just slapped on top of something. When the trappings are just slapped on top, you lose the ideas part. Again, I grew up on classic Star Trek. I loved classic Star Trek. I was there when Star Trek The Next Generation went on the air, September 27th, 1987. I was there when Deep Space Nine came out. But really, I don't know if I consider Star Trek at its core to be what I would call idea-based science fiction. I think Star Trek is just a Western with science fiction tropes. And then you go and you look at another series that may be like the Twilight Zone. The Twilight Zone is also science fiction, but it was about all of these different ideas. In a lot of cases, you could also possibly make the same argument about Star Trek that, well, the Twilight Zone is just a family drama or a sitcom or a Western with a science fiction trapping put over it. And I would argue that you're not wrong, but you're not right either. Something like the Twilight Zone is more bursting with ideas than something like classic Star Trek. Because really, when you break it down, classic Star Trek, while there were some episodes with some really great science fiction ideas, most of them aren't that. Like I said, most of them are a cop show or a Western with just another trapping thrown on it. And that doesn't mean you can't have good ideas even in not just that setting, but in like a Western. Harlan Ellison, there used to be a TV show called the Cimarron Strip. It was just a basic Western. It wasn't special. It wasn't bad. It wasn't good. It was just like a Gunsmoke, Ponderosa Bonanza sort of Western. But like when Harlan Ellison wrote an episode of Cimarron Strip, he brought ideas to it. He didn't want to just make a Western. He came up with the idea, what if Jack the Ripper didn't just stop ripping over in England, but now that the West is being explored, that Jack the Ripper moved over here. And when the Cimarron Strip was set, this would be about the time of the rippings. That what if he came over to America and started ripping over here? And you think to yourself, damn, that's actually a pretty cool idea, honestly. And that's the kind of thinking you get when you get a science fiction writer, someone with ideas that is tasked with making something like a Western. They say, what can we do that's not like a Western? And that's why I want to know. I want to hear from you guys. What got you into science fiction? Were you drawn to the ideas, the something like, oh my God, I've never thought about something like that. I wonder what would happen if such and such and such happened. Or are you more of the, look, I just really like space battles and laser swords and ships blowing up, and I like sound in space. I like the ships going, meow, even though that's scientifically inaccurate. Or are you something like 2001: A Space Odyssey, which is honestly one of the most boring films ever made in the history of the entire medium, which at least it's about ideas. It's boring, it's plotting, but there's an idea at the core of something like 2001. Or are you into a cyberpunk sort of thing? A couple of weeks ago, I talked about cyberpunk. I've always loved cyberpunk. I've been so drawn to cyberpunk. Why am I drawn to cyberpunk? I can't answer you that. I am drawn to cyberpunk, but I can't answer to you why I'm drawn to cyberpunk. And that's also one of the draws of science fiction. Why? Why? You can't put it to words. Why are you into this stuff? I don't know. You just are. Why did something like Buffy the Vampire Slayer take off at the same time something like Firefly did not? They're by the same creator. They were aimed at the same audience. But in one case, the audience just didn't show up. Why is it? Is it that the times had changed because there had been a few years between those two things? Or was it that while both were in the genre of science fiction, I'm going to call vampires science fiction basically, was one more sci-fi and one more science fiction? And that's the question you have to ask yourself. What is it that you like about science fiction? Do you like just a tale of something that can't possibly happen? Or do you like the what-if nature? Like when you watch Black Mirror, do you just go, wow, that really asked a good what if? What if such and such happened? What if? That is the core of science fiction, I think. What if? Because science fiction in and of itself is an inherently positive medium. And yeah, there is some bleak-ass sci-fi stuff. But it's always about the future. Even if it's taking place today, it's thinking ahead. It's saying, there will be a future. We might be all living like maggots and working in the sugar farms for our alien ant overlords, but there will be a future. It might be a terrible future, but there will be a future. There will be something. Science fiction is about thinking ahead. And like I said, that doesn't necessarily mean, oh, it takes place in the future. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the ideas, the core of science fiction. So I want to hear from you. I want to know what got you into it. Was it a TV show? Was it a video game? A movie? A book? A comic book? What is it that made you a science fiction fan? So for that, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to look at nostalgia-sploitation, which is a word you may not have heard before, but you've definitely fell victim to this.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Nostalgia. We all remember things from our past. We have a nostalgic look at our childhood. We have a nostalgic look at the things that were in our childhood. But what happens when those who are responsible for whatever medium we're talking about manipulate you and exploit you for those things from your childhood? What if they prey on your nostalgia? And that's where the genre of nostalgia-sploitation comes in. This is not a new thing. You've seen this for many, 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 many years. But it's more pervasive now than ever. You've got so many TV shows and so many movies that are like, hey, look, it's the 80s. We're making this like in the 80s. It's got neon like in the 80s. It's got an 80s soundtrack. Hey, remember this? This was an 80s video game. We're going to reference an 80s movie. That's nostalgia-sploitation. For instance, like Stranger Things. I thought Stranger Things Season 1 was not terrible at this. They were guilty of it to a degree where they would reference things just to make people go, oh, I remember that. Oh, how do I remember that? And then Season 2 is just pure, unadulterated nostalgia-sploitation. It was absolutely asinine how exploitative it was. And look at this, 80s, 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 80s. You had that movie like Summer of 1984. You had that absolutely horrendous and insulting American Horror Story 84 season that was, okay, I don't like that show to begin with, but that season was unwatchable. The whole thing was that there was nothing there. It was all remember this, reference this. It's like a Setzer and Freeberg movie. The epic movie, disaster movie, those guys who are probably the least funny comedians in the history of ever. All they do is reference things. Hey, look, Jack Sparrow's here. We don't have a joke for it, but you remember Jack Sparrow, right? So that's funny because there's a guy dressed up as Jack Sparrow. That's what I'm talking about. And this is not just limited to television. You've got so many movies that are like this. And right now, it's the 80s. Right now, nostalgia-sploitation is hitting hard into the 80s. But you're starting to see the 90s nostalgia-sploitation coming up. And there was a 70s Italian. There was a 70s nostalgia-sploitation way back in the 90s. And then in the 2000s, it became the 80s nostalgia-sploitation. And I think this is a problem. You need to stop falling for this. You need to stop looking at a movie like Ready Player One, or I mean that movie shouldn't be called Ready Player One. It should be called Movie Reference The Movie. Because all that movie is referencing, oh, hey, you remember that game? Oh, remember that comic book? Oh, look, Spawn showed up. Oh, my God, there's the Iron Giant. Oh, my God, there's this. Oh, my God, I remember that comic book. There's absolutely no substance to Ready Player One. None. Zero. It's just, hey, I remember that. The movie. It's the same thing if you would just string together a whole bunch of clips from old commercials. It's the exact same thing that Ready Player One is. And nostalgia-sploitation is a big problem because, for one thing, it doesn't remember. It's not exploiting the right aspects of whatever it's talking about, whatever decade, whatever genre, subgenre, whatever. That's where the problem comes in, because you get things like Stranger Things that are all about the 80s, but then you have, like, Escape from North Korea. That's a short film that is supposed to be, oh my God, we're going back to the 80s. Or like that Kung Fury, where everything is neon, everything is purple. It's got that soft focus like you get on VHS, and I have a big problem with that crap too. And all they do is, hey, this is what those movies used to be like when we watched them. You show me one 80s movie that's actually like that. Okay, there might be elements. Something here, something here, something here in a movie. But the nostalgia-sploitation really comes about because people are misremembering the past. And a lot of times, not all the time, but a lot of times, these people were not even there at the time. I've seen some music videos by, like, Bonnie McKee. I really like her bombastic video. I think it's a lot of fun. It is nostalgia-sploitation. It's a lot of fun. And then I looked her up. She wasn't even born until the 80s were almost over. So how is she having these fond memories of 1982 when she didn't exist yet? That doesn't mean you can't like something. I was born in 1975. I love Universal horror movies from the 1930s. I didn't exist yet. I love 60s cinema from Roger Corman and Dennis Hopper and Orson Welles. I love 70s movies. I didn't exist for a lot of that. That doesn't mean you can't love these things. But it's weird when you have nostalgia for an age that you didn't live in. And that's what nostalgia-sploitation really is. It's nostalgia for something that never existed. It's sort of like, now, this is not a nostalgia-sploitation, although it does take place in the past and is very stylized. But the movie Mandy by Panos Cosmatos, he made that movie. He said when he was a kid that his dad would not let him rent movies like Scanners and Friday the 13th and things like that. So all he could do was look at the cover art and imagine what that movie was. And that's what Mandy is. It's his version of looking at the cover art of a VHS tape and imagining what the movie contained therein may be. Is that a form of nostalgia exploitation? Kind of, but not really. Because there's not a lot of 80s in a movie like Mandy. It takes place in 1983, and there's a thing here, a thing there. It's not exploitative. Well, it is exploitative, but not in that area. It's exploitative in an exploitation movie sort of way. And the thing about it is, nostalgia exploitation, it talks down to you. Nostalgia exploitation thinks you're dumb. And that's where the biggest problem comes in. Nostalgia exploitation assumes you're stupid. And because of that, we can tell you what the 80s were like. We can tell you what the 70s were like. We can tell you what the 90s were like. Because we're referencing things you remember. Your serotonin level goes up when all of a sudden you see, oh, I used to have that. Oh, I used to have that wallpaper. Oh my God, that show. I remember watching that show. And now the characters in this movie, they're watching that show. Your serotonin levels go up and you enjoy the movie more because it's playing on your nostalgia. It's exploiting your nostalgia. And I have a problem with that. Now, that doesn't mean a movie cannot reference something. That doesn't mean if your story needs to be set in 1987 for whatever reason, maybe you need your story set in a time where cell phones or the internet are not an option to get away from the killer. So, well, it's just easier to set it in 1987. That doesn't mean you can't reference things. Doesn't mean you can't have an Evil Dead poster on your main character's wall. It means when the bulk of what they're doing is going, hey, remember that? That is exploitative. That's where the problem I have comes in. And that's what we have to stop. If you're a true science fiction fan, you should be angry that you're being talked down to. And a lot of times you're not. I saw so many people praising that American Horror Story 84 season. They're like, oh my God, they kept referencing things. Yeah, referencing things is not writing. You're not a good writer. You're not a good producer, a good director if all you can do is reference something else. That's not quality. Stop giving it the air of quality, damn it. Be a little bit more picky. And as I said, that doesn't mean you can't reference something. Sometimes it's really nice when all of a sudden you're watching a TV show, maybe something you don't even expect. And you just go, wait a minute, why does that character have a Terminator poster on the wall? It never comes up. It's just something in the background. Like I remember in Sons of Anarchy in the last couple of seasons, it's a show about drug dealing, murdering bikers. And I thought it was so random that in Jax's son's room, there's a Sega CD. The film takes place contemporarily. And it's never explained, but there's a clear Sega CD in his son's room. And you're like, that is so random. And I thought that was kind of neat. But the reason I don't consider that exploitative, they never reference it. They're never like, hey, son, you want to play one of them Sega CD games? It's just there. It doesn't change the story if you know it or not, if you even recognize that there's a Sega CD in the background. I did, because I remember when I got a Sega CD. I remember how great it was. Not counting the FMV stuff. I'm talking the actual games like Spider-Man and Terminator, but that's a whole different topic. So when it comes to nostalgia exploitation, I call it that because it is pure exploitation. The same way it would be blaxploitation, nunsploitation, Nazi-sploitation, Italian-sploitation, whatever. There's all those different exploitations. And nostalgia exploitation is no different. Except it's a little bit more insidious because you don't know you're being talked down to. When you watch a Jess Franco Ilsa movie, you know what you're getting. You're getting a Nazi-sploitation, sexploitation movie. So it's different when something like Ready Player One tries to bandy itself around as some heady object that, oh my God, this is just so intelligent. I saw so many reviews of movie reference to the movie, Ready Player One, that called it so intelligent. I started going, what? I mean, even Spielberg said Ernest Cline's hack novel, Ready Player One, he called it one of the most brilliant pieces of science fiction he'd ever read. And I thought, all right, Spielberg, you need to calm down because your brain clearly is full of amoebas or something. Ernest Cline is the biggest hack on the planet, and that's even remembering that Stephanie Meyer exists, or what was her name? E.L. James. They exist. And Ernest Cline's the biggest hack out there. Ready Player One, the book, was just referencing things. Well, I'm going to get in my DeLorean with its flux capacitor, and I'm going to put my Ghostbuster sticker on there, and then I'm going to play my Sega music, and then we're going to go visit Spawn. And it's like, all you're doing is referencing things. That's not writing. The fact that Ernest Cline has more money than I'll ever see in my entire life pisses me off. Yes, it does. And he is the king of nostalgia exploitation. And you all keep falling for it. That's what my problem is. Stop falling for it. Stop watching crap like Kung Fury. Stop being exploited. Because remember, that's the thing about exploitation. You have to be willing to be exploited. They might be exploiting whatever the exploitation genre is, but they also need you to be playing along with it. And that's where the problem comes in here. Stop playing along with it. Stop being exploited. Nostalgia exploitation should never become a damn genre. But it has. It's an entire genre. The same as rip-off exploitation, the garbage that the Asylum shoves out. These things shouldn't be genres, and the fact that they are says more about, I'm speaking just about America right now, about the American viewing public than anything else. Because these movies are usually about American nostalgia. And you need to be more picky about what you watch and how you watch it. Stop letting movies talk down to you. So all that said, if you're still listening after all of my rants, we are going to take another break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about one of the comic book companies you may have forgot actually exists, but really played a large part in how you ingest comic books today.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
How many of you have ever heard of Atlas Comics? Okay, I need to back up. How many of you heard of Atlas Seaboard Comics? Because a lot of you might immediately have said, oh, I know Atlas Comics. That's what Marvel Comics was before they were Marvel Comics. And you would not be wrong. But that's not the Atlas I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the Atlas that would become Marvel Comics. I'm talking about the Atlas that was the rival to Marvel Comics. So you might not know Atlas, and odds are, if you've run across an Atlas comic at any point in your back issue buying, it's probably in a quarter box, and you probably were like, what the hell is this? What you might not realize, though, is just how important Atlas Comics was in what comic books became by the 1980s. Without Atlas, you wouldn't have Watchmen. You wouldn't have Dark Knight Returns. You wouldn't have the Avengers the way you know them. You wouldn't have Green Arrow, the Longbow Hunters. You wouldn't have the Claremont Byrne X-Men if it was not for Atlas Comics. So what was Atlas? So before Stan Lee was publisher of Marvel, now they had stopped being Atlas at this point and they were Marvel Comics. Stan Lee was already working with Jack Kirby on creating Incredible Hulk, Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, things like that. And the publisher of Marvel Comics at the time was a man named Martin Goodwin. And the thing about Martin Goodwin was he saw himself as the main creative force behind Marvel. Now, he didn't write any of the books. He didn't draw any of them. But like when he saw what DC Comics had done with the Justice League, he's the one who told Stan Lee, hey, I kind of want our own Justice League. Go create something like this, a team book. And Stan Lee came up with the Fantastic Four, etc. You know, hey, DC's doing this. We need our own version. And he would task Stan Lee to create the Credible Hulk or something. So it wasn't just like that Stan Lee said, hey, I want to create this. He was told to by Martin Goodman. Now, the thing with Martin Goodman is he considered that being the creative input, the creative side of this. And eventually he was going to step down from Marvel, and he wanted his son, Charlie Goodman, to take over as the publisher of Marvel Comics. His son, who was inept at everything, and that'll become very clear later, who knew nothing about comics and really didn't have a lot of interest in it, he wanted to leave Marvel to his son. Well, the Marvel shareholders decided that Stan Lee, actually creating the Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, etc. like that, or co-creating, I should say, would be a better choice as publisher. So Goodman got pissed off. He sold his shares in Marvel and went and created a rival comic book company in 1975. This company was called Atlas Comics. It was actually published by Seaboard. And this whole thing was a bitter, bitter battle about getting back at Stan Lee and getting back at Marvel and proving I am what made Marvel Comics, not Stan. So that's why he chose the name Atlas. It's not a coincidence that Marvel used to be called Atlas and now Goodman is calling his new company Atlas. So he decided Marvel's thing at the time was they were called the House of Ideas. You know, all their trade ads and all that. The House of Ideas. So Atlas's catchphrase was the new House of Ideas. A not-so-subtle swipe at Stan Lee and Marvel Comics. DC doesn't really play a whole lot in this. This is basically a battle between Goodman and Stan Lee at this point. So he decided, look, how I'm going to get people over here. We're going to have a higher page rate for writers and artists than Marvel or DC. We're going to give them full creative control as long as they fall into the comics code. They can do whatever they want. And something that Marvel and DC to this day still won't do. The creators got to own their own comics. They got to own their creations. So you would think, in theory, this is amazing. How did Atlas only last a little over a year? They had a ton of money. They had millions of dollars behind them. They had higher page rates on everything. You got to own your own work. And while they did siphon off certain people like Howard Chaykin and there were some others, there was this unofficial sort of blackball that was put out in the comic industry at the time. And it more or less said, if you work for DC, you have to be loyal to DC. If you work for Marvel, You have to be loyal to Marvel. That's why you didn't see a lot of writers and artists working at both Marvel and DC like you would in the 80s and 90s. You saw this basically, it was an unwritten rule. They couldn't legally enforce this, so there was an unwritten rule that Marvel writers and artists don't work for DC and vice versa. That's why you don't see Stephen Bissett and Alan Moore writing Marvel comics, because they were DC guys and vice versa. So that also played into Atlas. There was this unofficial word put out. Hey, any Marvel, any DC artists and writers, if you go over to Atlas, you're not getting work at Marvel or DC anymore. You make your choice now. You're loyal to one or the other. So they gave a lot of people their first shot at Atlas, and they had some really good ideas. They had some really good comics. They had some really bad comics too. They had them. Goodman trying to get back at Marvel became a little noticeable right off the bat, because like the character the Brute is almost plagiaristic of the Hulk. Wolf the Barbarian was Conan. Now, Marvel was publishing Conan at the time. Things like that. Grim Ghost is Ghost Rider, etc. And we're talking just not close enough to be considered plagiarism, but borderline plagiarism. So that, there was a little bit of a lack of creativity in that. And initially, nobody really bought these comics. The first 3 issues, a lot of these comics, a lot of the stuff they put out, like Barbarians, Blazing Battle Tales, The Brute, The Cougar, Demon Hunter, Destructor, Son of Dracula, Hands of the Dragon, Ironjaw, Phoenix, Planet of Vampires, The Scorpion, etc., they didn't make it past a 3rd issue. Most of this stuff was canceled after 1-2 issues because nobody was buying this stuff. Because you also got to remember, one of the ways Marvel, and they would do this again in the 90s, one of the ways that they would play super, super dirty was this all stuff, independent comic book stores don't really exist at this point. So the whole point was, we are doing this for the newsstands, and there's only so much space on a newsstand. That's the problem. So Marvel started putting out more and more titles. The Atlas stuff just got lost in the static. No one even knew most of this stuff was there. And there was some pretty interesting stuff. The Scorpion, Howard Chaykin's book, damn good. And he basically, after Atlas went over, because he owned it, Dominic Fortune from Marvel is the Scorpion. Just legally changed names, but it's the exact same character with everything there. I thought Planet of Vampires was actually really good. It's sort of Planet of the Apes, but with vampires. There is a movie called Planet of the Vampires from the 60s. It's not really anything like that. It's much more Planet of the Apes, but instead of apes, it's vampires. And the whole thing, this lasted a little bit less than a year before Atlas was totally out of ideas and out of money. And the main reason for that is Martin Goodman put the company in the hands of his son, the one he wanted to run Marvel. And Charlie Goodman had no idea how to run a comic book company. He had no interest in it. He was mismatching editors with the wrong books, with the wrong style. He had people who had come from Warren and other companies, which were the black and white magazines. He'd put them on the color superheroes, and then he would have people who'd only worked on color superhero books writing the magazine, the black and white monster magazines for Atlas. And it was just, in a way, it was a cautionary tale that showed what Marvel Comics could have been if Goodman had gotten his way and instituted his son in that position and not Stan Lee. Marvel Comics could have gone under because Charlie Goodman just had absolutely nothing. He had no interest in this, and he was absolutely terrible at it. And so Atlas just sort of went away. Some of the artists, like Neil Adams and Howard Chaykin, even though there was that unofficial blacklist, they were just they were just too good at what they did to be able to be cut out completely. And you had people like Steve Ditko and Wally Wood working on some of these books. These were just names you couldn't blackball. So they were welcomed back into the Marvel or DC fold, and Atlas became a footnote in history, except for the fact that Marvel and DC, in their effort to compete with Atlas, they had to raise their page rates. And they had to, Marvel still doesn't do this, but DC, DC will not let you own what you create for them. You get a percentage of, it's not ownership, I don't know exactly what they would call it, but say you create a character for DC Comics. That character ends up getting used in a DC animated movie, or shows up on Arrow or Supergirl or something like that. You get royalties off that. Marvel doesn't do that. So for DC, while you may not own a character that shows up on Titans, when that character does show up on the Titans TV show, you get a check. So that's at least something, and that came almost more or less indirectly from what Atlas did. Because Atlas really changed the game. Even though they were only around for a year, and if you think about it on a certain level, had almost no impact. They also changed things behind the scenes to the point where Marvel and DC had to change to keep up with them. And that's what I just wanted to talk to you about. You might not know Atlas Comics, but there's some really good stuff out there. Go and find some of these Atlas books in quarter boxes, and you'll find some damn good reads. And that's the interesting thing, especially because Atlas came up again about, I don't know, a year or two ago. Some investor said he bought all of Atlas's assets and that he wants to create an Atlas cinematic universe by adapting Iron Jaw and Morlock 2001 and all this. And he wants to compete with Marvel. Maybe this is history repeating itself, I'm not sure. But then when you think about it, you go, but all the creators own their own work, so you don't actually own Grim Ghost. You don't actually own Demon Hunter. You don't actually own the Cougar, etc. It becomes really sticky, and the guy who bought it says, oh, I own all this stuff. But the creators own it, so no, you don't. You know, we don't want to get into the whole Miracle Man situation when Eclipse went out again. So I say, you might not have heard of Atlas Comics, but I guarantee if you've gone through a quarter box, you've run across some of these. Probably beat up. Give them a chance. These are some really good reads. You'll find some good artwork. You'll find some good stories. And you'll be looking at a part of comic book history that, as I said, is almost a what if. Because you can really see, because of how much Goodman was trying to ape Marvel, not only in the advertising, but in the characters, the artwork, the page layout, the logo. He was really trying to ape Marvel Comics. And the fact that this failed so spectacularly really gives you a sort of what if. What if Goodman had beaten Stan Lee and put his son in charge of Marvel? Could Marvel have stopped existing by the 70s? That's the interesting thing to look at. And I think that's where Atlas Seaboard really comes into its own, is as an interesting footnote. If nothing else, it's an interesting footnote. So when we come back, we're going to take a break in a moment. When we come back, I want to talk to you about Howard Phillips Lovecraft. Now, this is one of the most original and unique writers that's ever worked in the science fiction horror field, and also one of the most problematic. So we'll look at HP Lovecraft when we come back.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
HP Lovecraft. It's a name you hear a lot because he did a lot, actually, for the genre of science fiction, for the genre of fantasy, for the genres of horror. But at the same time, HP Lovecraft is a very problematic name for a lot of reasons, actually. And that's what I want to talk about today. Where does the art and the artist stop? Especially how much can you separate the art and the artist when the problems and the problematic nature are so inherently tied to one another. For instance, so Howard Philip Lovecraft, he created From Beyond, Reanimator, the Catacombs, the Dreams in the Witch House, Cthulhu, and by the way, that's how it's pronounced. It's supposed to be, it's not Cthulhu. Stop saying Cthulhu. It's Cthulhu. You're supposed to be like it's coming from the back of your throat, like you're spitting the name out. Cthulhu. Cthulhu. Stop saying Cthulhu. You sound like the same people that say Neanderthal. So you guys know it's not pronounced Neanderthal. It's Neanderthal. The T and the H are together, but they're not pronounced together. I always love when I'm watching some sci-fi movie, some horror movie, and the scientist goes, well, he seems like a Neanderthal. And I say, well, you seem like you don't know how to say Neanderthal. Watch a documentary. You'll see all of the anthropologists say Neanderthal. And it's the same thing with Cthulhu. It's like you're spitting the name out. But the thing with Lovecraft was he had all these great ideas. Or I should say he had a couple of great ideas that he kept recycling over and over and over and over again. The unnameable thing, the eldritch horrors, these things that are just unnameable, unspeakable. In a way, you might almost call it a cheat, how he rarely described the monsters in his stories, because they were so indescribable that man looking at them would just go mad and they couldn't describe it. He also had a cheat that I can't stand when writers do this. And I guess it was more forgivable in the early 1900s and the 1920s when he was writing than it is now. But when the whole thing is, I guess what you'd almost call found footage, like, how Bram Stoker's Dracula was all written in diary segments from Mina, from Jonathan, etc., etc. And that's a lot of times what Lovecraft would do is these things would be written as a journal. So you do get only one perspective of a story, which is kind of interesting. But then you often bring up, why are you still writing? Like some of these, I think maybe it was Dunwich Horror or something like that, where it was like, the creature's behind me. I can feel its hot breath on my neck. It's about to kill me. Well, then why are you still writing in your journal? Get the hell out of the room, moron! So there is a bit of a cheat like that. But Lovecraft would think of these ideas, non-Euclidean geometry, these unnameable things, these cults built around ancient beasts that predate everything that exists on Earth. And his imagination was just so great. He came up with the basis of everything we think of, not just for cosmic horror, but if you even think of just science fiction in general. Lovecraft laid the groundwork for all that. Obviously, science fiction existed prior to Lovecraft, but it was different, is the only way I'll put it. So when you got someone like Lovecraft coming up with all of these fantastic ideas, and then you just go, where's he getting all these from? Well, part of it was probably psychosis. Part of it was that he was a very sheltered child, and he was also a very abused child, living with his dad died of syphilis, so his dad died insane, and then his mom had various insanities, and she would treat him like a little girl. She would basically keep him in a dark room and all this. And I guess that makes your imagination go to other places, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, it's bad that it happened to him, but your imagination going out there is not necessarily a bad thing. The problem that comes when you read Lovecraft today, when you read the original Lovecraft stories, and this is where it becomes problematic, Lovecraft was an unabashed racist. I mean, terms I'm not allowed to use, he would just freely write on a page. He really thought black people were some subhuman race. He has a poem whose title I can't even say. It's called On the Creation of Word I'm Not Allowed to Say. And it's all about how black people were made up of the leftover pieces after God created the universe, and he created them all as beasts. You look at the way in the original Reanimator story, how he describes a black boxer as this ape-like creature. He describes Jewish people. I'm Jewish, so I don't know if I can use the term Jews. He describes Jews as this sort of inhuman thing that doesn't feel like it's supposed to be human. He hated Chinese people. He was extremely xenophobic. You look at any of his works, and there's just so much xenophobia. There's so much racism. There's so much sexism. Like, women exist only to help a man. Women exist only to aid in what the man is doing, because the man is most important. The man has the intelligence, the white Christian man. And so that's where the subject comes to. With all of the great ideas, all of the things he created, all the monsters, all the worlds that became the basis of everything that we're looking at and reading today, how problematic are the other things that are in Lovecraft's works? I mean, you can go and read Tom Sawyer and remember what Jim was called. Well, does that make that a problematic work nowadays? Or not? So when it comes to Lovecraft, you have this giant debate, because you have all these people who spit on Lovecraft for what he believed, and what he believed was vile. I mean, I guess he learned, because he eventually fell in love and married a Jewish girl. So I guess he learned that maybe he was wrong. But at the same time, you've got all these people who are building their legacy on Lovecraft, on Lovecraftian creatures. They're using his name. They're using all of the aspects, because most of his works are in the public domain, so anybody can make an adaptation of the Cthulhu mythos or anything like that, at the Mountains of Madness, whatever. But you've got these people who spit on Lovecraft, but then say, hey, but I'm going to make my bones off of his work. I'm going to use the name Lovecraft. I'm going to use the creatures he created. I'm going to use these eldritch horrors, but on the man himself. So that begs the question then, just where is that line? If you hate what he stood for, and you really should, because he stood for vile things, then is it right that you're using these things from him? Isn't that almost a literal definition of exploitation? Is Lovecraft exploitation an actual thing now? Because you've got like Jordan Peele's Lovecraft Country. It's not out yet, so obviously I haven't seen it. I do not like Jordan Peele at all, and the trailers do not fill me with hope. Jordan Peele seems to be spending the entire press junket, or the pre-Lovecraft Country materials, as Racism, 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 racism. Oh, but also Lovecraft was awesome and he was a real forward thinker in terms of his monsters, so I'm going to use his monsters, but racism, racism, racism. So when it comes to someone like Lovecraft, or even Robert E. Howard, go and read some of those early Conan stories. There's some graphic depictions of black people as basically talking monkeys. And you go, oh, this is hard to read. When you read some of that, or you go to read the Edgar Rice Burroughs, you read all those old pulp stuff, they're all very problematic in today's age. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't be problematic. I hate cancel culture. I hate this SJW stuff, but racism is straight up a wrong thing. So where does someone like Lovecraft fall in this? Where do you fall on Lovecraft? Do you look at his work as, well, it is what it is? Or do you look at Lovecraft's work as, well, he was a product of his time, and racism and xenophobia and anti-Semitism was also a product of that time, and it's not just Lovecraft's work. You got all the science fiction, fantasy, and horror works of that time. It's really hard to find one of those without all these racial slurs and racial stereotypes in them. So, does that mean that Lovecraft should be unpersoned? Does that mean you should not be able to continue to make works off the base of it? I don't mean on a legal basis. I don't mean you shouldn't be allowed to. I mean, if you're going patooey on the man, is there some inherent two-facedness about, but I love the creations that he made. I love these fish people. I love all of these elder gods, and we're going to keep using those. Where does the art and the artist separate? Like in the Joker movie, there's the famous scene where he's dancing to Rock and Roll Part 2 by Gary Glitter, a convicted child molester. So do you go, okay, I really like that song, but man, Gary Glitter, man, that's really problematic. And I think things, not Gary Glitter, I think there's absolutely no excuse for child molestation or child porn or any of that crap. But when it comes to someone like Lovecraft, can you put it into the context of the times when the stories were written? Or is it just, this is straight up racist, and I don't care if there's cool ideas about, I can't remember if they called it a resonator in the original From Beyond story, because I've seen the movie way more times, or like this resonator bringing these other dimensions together. But you also got to remember, he had a, I think it was like a Sikh manservant in that. And you go, oh, problematic. Because to me, Lovecraft was a genius. He was also a terrible, terrible person. And I am able to separate those two things. But at the same time, part of me says, should I? Should I separate those two things? Because when you really break it down, shouldn't a terrible person not be rewarded? Now, obviously Lovecraft's dead, so he's not rewarded in one way or another. If you love his stories, if, Reanimator was made years after, he'd been dead for, I can't remember how long at that point and all this. When you use something from Lovecraft, you might not be rewarding him financially or anything like that, but you are keeping his name out there. Lovecraft is one of those names that just won't go away. And I think for good reason. He had so many great ideas. At the same time, he was a terrible person. And the fact that he wasn't seen as a terrible person at the time, well, okay, I should backtrack a little bit. He kind of was. When some of his friends from that time would write about him, his racism and xenophobia and sexism and anti-Semitism, even they thought it was extreme for the time. And so that really says something about the man Howard Phillips Lovecraft was. When even at the time they were going, dude, right-wing wasn't a thing yet. Dude, this is some real right-wing propaganda right here. Because I remember reading these stories. I didn't know any of this stuff. I remember picking up a couple of the collections when I was a kid. Again, I was probably way too young to be reading this stuff. And I remember reading this and, it's kind of got that old worldy sort of language to it, which makes it a little dense, not in a stupid way. I mean dense as hard to get through in a bit. You kind of got to acclimate yourself when you're reading HP Lovecraft. And I don't remember the racism sticking out at the time, because probably when I was 8 or 9, I didn't really know what the racism was. I didn't quite understand that. Now I reread some of that and I just go, oh, this is really problematic. I don't even like that word problematic, but it's the only word I can think of right now. So where do you fall on Howard Phillips Lovecraft and the work of Howard Phillips Lovecraft, HP Lovecraft? So I want to thank you for listening to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I also want to ask that you remember to subscribe to the show and you write a review, because that really helps us out and you can communicate with us that way. Also, if you want to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all of that nonsense. So think about what I said. Thank you. Have a good night, guys.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.